Wonderful as always. I have mentioned the theme, the minor theme, several times to you as I've spoken, as what is the church for? What is its purpose in society? Well, I think that we have not scratched the surface in terms of understanding what the church is for and what it does and its important function in society, especially a church like this. Next week, we're going to highlight the social action function of a congregation like this. But today, I'd like to focus on another important function, as I understand it, and it has to do with this subject of rejection versus acceptance. Are we an arena? Are we a space in society that practices radical acceptance? Or are we part of the general culture, which is a culture of judgment and rejection? And I wanted to talk a bit about what I mean by those terms. What does it really, truly mean to accept oneself and to accept others? What does it truly mean to be rejected? And how does that impact us emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and even physically? I would like to start by describing what is involved in being rejected, because I think if we understand the power of rejection, we will gain a greater appreciation of what the power of acceptance means. There are two people in America that have explored more or as much as anyone in the world what rejection means and what it looks like and what its impact is. The first person I will mention is Professor Naomi Eisenberger of UCLA, where she's a social psychologist. And she often starts her talks out by saying, do you notice that people talk about emotional losses in the same way they talk about a physical loss? It broke my heart is an example of that. And she says that if you notice the language that people use about being rejected or losing something significant, it tracks very closely a physical injury or something like it. She said that that is true for the English language, but remarkably, it's also true for languages throughout the world. Her research, which she has focused her entire career on studying this issue, her research has suggested that the pain of social rejection may be more than a figure of speech. Through a series of studies and through studying the studies of others, she and her colleagues have shown that socially painful experiences, such as exclusion or rejection, are processed by some of the same neural regions in the brain that process physical pain. She explains this by saying, we as a species live and have lived only because of our intimate connection to a social group, whether it's family or something beyond the family. Its members, the members of our species, benefit greatly from shared responsibility for gathering food, thwarting predators, and caring for offspring. And this occurred over the thousands and 10,000s of years of evolution. Given that being socially disconnected is so detrimental to our survival as a species, or has been throughout the long history of our evolution, the social attachment system, which ensures social closeness, piggybacked into the physical pain system, borrowing the pain signal to cue instances of social separation. And over the course of our evolutionary history, avoiding social rejection and remaining connected to others ensured survival. The heartache following a broken social relationship serves a valuable function, namely to ensure the maintenance of close social ties. And so for us as a species, rejection literally hurts us in a way that is analogous to physical pain. A second person I will mention is Professor J.T. Capeppo. He is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's the founder of the Chicago Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience and co-founder of the general field of social neuroscience. The experience of rejection leads to the isolation of the person, or what he calls loneliness, and that is what he studied, loneliness, which is the symptom or the condition of being rejected. In his research, he concluded that feelings of loneliness decrease the lifespan and have a huge impact on a wide range of emotional and cognitive processes. Loneliness in his studies, and this is all he studied his entire adult life, loneliness has been associated with personality disorders, suicidal thinking, impaired cognitive performance, and cognitive decline over time, the increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and increases in depressive symptoms of all kinds. A particularly devastating consequence of feeling socially isolated is cognitive decline and dementia. Capeppo believes that perceived social isolation is tantamount to feeling unsafe and sets off an instinctive and implicit hypervigilance, looking out for additional threats from the social environment. Implicit hypervigilance for social threat then alters the psychological process that affects physiological functioning, diminishes sleep quality, and increases the possibility of an early death. Lonely individuals, he wrote, see the social world as a more threatening place. They expect more negative social interactions and remember more negative social information. And this self-reinforcing loop of loneliness is accompanied by feelings of hostility, stress, pessimism, anxiety, and low self-esteem, and represents a tendency that activates physical and mental and behavioral mechanisms that contribute to adverse health outcomes. So what he's saying is that the experience of loneliness, the experience of rejection, if intense and pervasive enough, fosters a hypervigilance for social threats of all kinds, which in turn exerts a powerful influence on our perceptions, on our thinking, on our cognitions, on our behaviors. Attempts to reduce loneliness by changing the external environment, by giving people more opportunities to be social, helps, his research shows. But more importantly, important than changing a person's social environment is changing a person's thinking about themselves and about the world in which they live. The cure for rejection and its symptoms such as loneliness and all the negative mind states associated with rejection are heavily dependent upon a shift in thinking toward what we might call radical acceptance. Tara Branch is a spiritual teacher and a Buddhist meditation teacher in the Washington, D.C. area. She's well known throughout the country. And in her thinking, she developed the idea that at the core of rejection, which fosters loneliness of all kinds, is what she calls the trance of unworthiness. The trance of unworthiness. And that radical acceptance dismantles the foundation of this trance. She writes, as a friend of mine put it, feeling that something is wrong with me is the invisible and toxic gas I am always breathing. When we experience life through this lens of personal insufficiency, she writes, we are imprisoned in what I call the trance of unworthiness. Trapped in this trance, we are unable to perceive the reality of who we really are. She goes on to say that fear of being a flawed person, of being someone that has a deficit, someone who is not good enough, someone who is insufficient in some way, lays at the root of this trance. And I, she wrote, have sacrificed many moments, many days, many years in trying to prove my worth. I inhabited a self-made prison that stopped me from living life fully. The idea of radical acceptance is at the core of Unitarian Universalist tradition and history. The idea of Unitarianism was based in part on this idea that we are part of one great life, that no one is better than another. The idea of universalism came with the concept that we are all equal, that none are excluded. And throughout our history as a movement, we have, at least in theory, embraced this idea of radical acceptance. But do we really understand what being a community of radical acceptance means and entails? Do we understand the power of the trance of unworthiness, as Branch describes it? Radical acceptance is a very powerful force. We know that because we know that radical rejection is an incredibly powerful force, affecting people mentally, emotionally, and even physically and cognitively. Radical acceptance means that we accept other people as they are, not for what we think they should be or ought to be or need to be. It means really letting go of the idea that other people need to be our version of what they should be. But at the same time, radical acceptance does not mean tolerating abuse or danger or manipulation. Radical acceptance also involves accepting ourselves fully for all our flaws and imperfections, and not judging ourselves by some standard we have picked up from the internet, from society, or from any other source. Radical acceptance of ourselves does not mean that we do not attempt to always try to be more mature, more principled, more ethical as persons. For trying to do these things is a form of self-love. But by accepting ourselves, by not condemning ourselves, by not comparing ourselves to others, by not judging ourselves in ways society encourages us to judge ourselves, by doing that, we are truly and genuinely accepting ourselves. I believe that one of the functions of a community like ours is to be a place of radical acceptance. Acceptance seems to be, at first glance, a much more humble word than love. We speak very freely of loving one another and showing love and compassion. But I must confess my preference for the word accept. Accept is a really radical notion, and I think this community and every UU community and really every religious community that's true to its vocation should be a place where people learn fully and deeply to love themselves, to accept themselves, and to accept one another, and to try to forge a community based on that radical acceptance.